So this week's parsha is Parshat Balak, and I want to explore the character of Bilaam, who is one of the more complicated characters, I would say, in this week's parsha. And I'm curious, like raise of hands or Zoom thumbs, if people are familiar with the storyline or if it like bears some going over first. Okay, I see a few at least middling thumbs. So let's just remind ourselves of where we are in the story. Bilaam is he's like a prophet for hire. He is a navi, a prophet, sort of not Jewish, but in that world at that time. And so there's a king, Balak, who wants to hire Bilaam to curse Bnei Israel. And maybe what we'll do is we'll open the parsha here and I'll share my screen for a second and we can just look at a little bit of the storyline because it seems on the surface as though Bilaam is not such a bad guy. And yet the Midrash fills in his backstory in a very colorful and not very nice, not complimentary light. And I think it's sort of unclear why. Like I think Bilaam has some interesting characteristics. And I meant to start by saying that one of my teachers and mentors, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, has a quote when he teaches young people to be leaders. He often says, when you're 20% ahead of the community, you're a visionary, 40% and you're called a heretic. Right, that there's this like very fine line between visionary and heretic. And I think that that's where Bilaam falls into that trap of just how far he sort of pushed. Right, it's sort of similar. I don't know if anyone's seen, there's a wonderful YouTube, if you Google it, I think it's called The Dancing Man. And it shows this guy dancing and it talks about how he's sort of like a wacko at this picnic or festival or whatever it is because he's dancing alone. But then this amazing thing happens and one person gets up behind him and then he has like a friend and then three people get up behind him, right? And he's all of a sudden become a leader. But like it's not really clear what is that tipping point, like what made him a leader and not a crazy guy dancing alone at a festival. And so I think like sort of toying with those ideas and thinking about leadership, we could think about Bilaam and why he is portrayed as more of a heretic than perhaps a visionary. So let's see here. So I'm going to share my screen for a minute and we can just run through a little bit of the story and then we'll delve into the why. So let's share here. So this week's parsha, here we go. Right, it starts here where Balak ben Zippor sees, right, Israel has become this big player in the desert community, and he sees what they've done to the Amorites, and he is worried. And so Balak is the king of Moab at that time, and they want to like get rid of the Jews, right? Deal with the Jews. The Jews have become too powerful, too forceful. And so they try to invite people, they try to invite Bilaam to come and to put a curse upon this people for me, right? Ki atzum, right? Which is also, they're too numerous for me, which is a very echoing of Paro. When Paro is worried about the Jews at the very beginning of Shmot, right? They're also atzum v'rav. So there's something about that. And so Balaam gets the message from Balak. From Balak. And then what's interesting is that God comes to Bilaam, V'yavo Elokim el Bilaam, and he asks, what do these men want of you? Which is like a super interesting theological question. God couldn't listen to the dignitaries, but he comes to Bilaam and Bilaam talks back to God. So I think like, right, there is some like credentialing of Navi-ness here, right? Bilaam is a person who's able to speak to God. And God says, don't go with them. And Bilaam listens in Pasuk Yod Chet, after the conversation is over. Balaam replies to Balak's officials. This is 22:18. And he says, even if you gave me all of the a house full of silver and gold, right? Malo beito kesef v'zahav lo uchal la'avor et pi Hashem Elohai la'asot ktana o gedola. I cannot do anything big or little contrary to the command of God. Right, so it's an interesting thing. Balak seems to be someone who's like willing to work with God, to obey or respect God's wishes. And so he says like politely no. And then God seems to change God's mind. And he says, actually, if the agents come to invite you again, go with them, but you have to listen to me, right? Like you have to be like a double agent or a secret agent, right? And then Bilam listens. So God said, if the agents come back, you can go. And so Bilam goes. But perhaps unfairly, God gets angry. God, I guess, didn't really want him to go in the end, right? So this is a story that's already full of like a little bit of confusion and murky detail. I think as a reader, like it's surprising to see Bilam speak to God so plainly, the way that like Abraham or Moshe does, right? Like our sort of greats. And Bilam is a non-Jewish prophet. And we see this fascinating scene, which we're not going to delve into now, where somehow his donkey sees God, but he doesn't see God, right? And so the donkey stops. It's definitely a good parsha to go to shul to because it's just so interesting, right? And Bilam keeps hitting the donkey, right, to say, keep on going. And finally, the donkey talks to Bilam. And the donkey says to Bilam, what are you doing? Right, so the whole story has such like an interesting like sort of air of mysteriousness and confusion and things that aren't going the way they're supposed to. You used to be able to go easily to another chapter. I want to scroll, long story short, because this is a long story, hence the difficulty of sort of pulling out the right psukim here at first. In Perek Daled 24, in Pasuk K. So finally, Bilam ends up in a place where he's going to give the curse. But what comes out of his mouth is something that we teach our children at Tachabat, right? He says, "Ma tohu ohalecha Yaakov mishkanotecha Yisrael." Right? How fair are your tents and your dwellings, Bnei Yisrael? He ends up complimenting them in the end of the day, right? So the story takes so many interesting twists. And again, I think that if you look just at the shot here, like the sort of very brief fly-by-night review over here, you can see that Bilam is someone who has Neviut. He says he wants to check with God. He checks with God, God talks to Bilam and says, no. Bilam says, sorry, can't do it. Talk to God, he said no. Then God changes his mind. Bilam says, okay. And then at the end of the day, when he stands up to give his prophecy, he actually says something nice. And so I'm going to stop the share for a minute just to say, right, so then I think the question is why? Why does the Navi, the Midrash get so upset or so uncomfortable with Bilam? Right, like the worst thing we can say, what we're not going to look at inside, right, is that Bilam was someone who slept with his donkey, which is like probably the biggest insult of the Midrash. And maybe of common day also. And so I think that there's one piece of Midrash that is very instructive. And so I want to look at that piece to think about like maybe why the Midrash is uncomfortable with Bilam, then to look at sort of like a radical reapproach, reimagining the story, and then to think a little bit about where Bilam prophesizes from. So 3 different like maybe answers or components to this conversation. And everyone should feel free to jump in whenever they desire. But Bamidbar Rabbah.
So
Happy, go ahead, please.
So just to help clarify this, because I find this have for a long time, very confusing. Which one, Bilam, Balaam, the names are similar, the donkey, whoever, it's like I get all mixed up. But Bilam, it keeps saying, is the son of Zippor, right? From Moab.
So that's Balak.
Oh, that's Balak. See, I'm
Balak is so the you know how you could remember Balak ends with a K, which stands for king, right? Balak is the king of Moab.
okay. All right.
He's Ben Sipor.
Okay. And so my first question is that like from Tzipporah, that also the wife of Moshe that was in, no,
No, because he's the king of Moab. He's like an enemy of Israel.
yeah, but where was Tzipporah before when Moshe met her?
She was in Midian, I think.
Midian. Okay, Midian, not Moab.
Phew,
Okay.
Rebecca confirmed. She's the
Still
expert
really
here.
confusing to me. I wish I had the characters.
Oh, and Rebecca is helpfully pointing out that Midian was the enemy of Moab. So Sipporah is definitely not. I think Ben Sipor is also probably the father's name, not the wife's name.
Yeah, that's why I was thinking it's masculine, right?
Yeah. So right, so Balak is just a neighboring king who is feeling nervous about the growing strength of Bnei Israel because they defeated the Amorites.
Okay.
And then, yes, it's unfortunate that the Navi he hires, his name is so similar. Bilaam is just the Hebrew and Balaam is the English pronunciation, like David and David.
Oh, that's the
They're
same
one
person?
guy. Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
So Bilaam slash Balaam is the Navi for hire, the prophet, and Balak is the king of Moab. But
Okay.
it is very unfortunate. Like, God forbid Bilaam's name had been something with some other letter that didn't sound anything like
Yeah.
Balak.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Bilam, Balaam, Moab, Midian.
Yeah, it's true. Moab and Midian is another one.
Yeah.
So Bilam, right? We saw that when God tells Bilam not to go, but then gives permission, that Bilam wakes up early in the morning and he goes. Right, we saw that pasuk, and so the Bamidbar Rabbah teaches us mikan atala made shebaderech she'adam rotzeh lelech ba molichin oto. From which means from this you learn that a person is led down the path that he wishes to go, which I think is such an interesting, like, psychological insight and also unfair characterization maybe of Bilam, right? But what I hear from that sentence, right, that a person is led down the path he wishes to go, is that like who we are as people and what we want is what drives our journeys in life, right? That if Bilam was a different kind of guy, he might not have gotten up so early to go. He might not have he might have heard, maybe read between the lines of God saying, okay, I guess if you want to, you can. Right? Like sometimes Will and I have like a disagreement. Like he says, okay, if that's the way you want to do it. And I'm like, but do you really? Like, is that really okay? Right? But Bilam was the kind of guy who said, okay, great, let's do it that way. And so that on some level, right, the rabbis are telling us, I think, that Bilam shouldn't have gone. Even if he thought God was telling him to, he knew that it was wrong. He knew that going to place himself in a place where he might curse Israel was not the right thing to do. And so I think with all leaders, right, possibly what is happening in Bamidbar Rabbah is a comparison between Abraham and Bilam. There's a lot of overlapping language between the story of Abraham waking up early and saddling his donkey to go do the Akedah, the sacrifice of Isaac, and this story of Bilam waking up early. And so I've seen before that maybe there's like a sort of the underbody of this idea is that it's really about Avraham and not about Bilam. But the Midrash didn't feel like they could outwardly criticize Avraham in such a strong way, right? But to say that it's probably difficult as a nabi. I can't identify exactly, but I imagine it's difficult to identify the difference between the real voice of God and some of your own internal desires. And so maybe as leaders or humans in our own lives, right, it's difficult to sometimes distinguish between our pure motives, where we like actually feel religiously or divinely inspired, or we feel like we're actually doing the right thing, and when are we like muddling in our own self-interests or our own things, right? Like what is our spiritual moral calling and what is our own internal desire? And so I think that this idea from the Midrash is very powerful because it's saying you have to stop and do that gut check every day that you get up in the morning, right? You can't you can't just assume that you heard the word of God correctly, right? Especially now that we're not prophets, and just go blindly charging ahead, because we are led down the path that we want to go down. And that we have to be careful to separate our own feelings from others. And so Bilam is scary, not because he's such a bad guy who sleeps with his donkey, like that's probably not true, but because he is just like all of us, right? He's just like everyone else who doesn't always learn how to separate pure motive from impure motive or self-interest. And that we see how dangerous that is there. And so I think that piece of Bilam is fascinating to me, especially as someone who aspires to hopefully be a good leader in the world, is to think about, everyone here that I'm looking at leads something in some capacity, right? And how do we separate those things out so that we don't just get up in the morning and run ahead when we know that maybe like we have that sort of like, feeling of like, maybe that's not right. So that's idea number one. Does that resonate? Make sense? Question? Yeah, so I think in that way, like, if anything, Bilam being a good guy is even more, hits the point home harder, right? Like, we all think we're good guys, and everyone here, especially, and I'm sure elsewhere, that we are good guys. But it is so easy to sometimes allow ourselves to convince ourselves that we're doing the right thing, and to say we're doing it in the right thing, but then not to. So that's a piece of it. And then, so now I want to pivot a little bit to say something crazy, which is that if we think about this story through the perspective of Moshe, I think we can look at something that's even more sort of subversive. Right, so we've seen that Moshe has struggled with his leadership and his prophecy, right? Just last week, we talked about how Moshe hit the rock when he was supposed to talk to the rock, and we saw that the Rambam says that like anger is such a strong emotion that if you display it too strongly, you'll end up like losing your leadership capacity because people won't respect you in the same way. And so Moshe is having like a super hard time. And so Rashi comments, and I'll get the exact pasuk pulled up in a second, that Moshe imagined and wrote Bilam's part of the dialogue. Like almost that this is maybe Moshe's dream state, right? Bilam has a prophecy that maybe Moshe wanted to say, but he could not say in his own words, right? Moshe is a leader who has a really hard time with his people. He struggles with them. He's often frustrated and discouraged by them, right? He tells God, like, these people want to kill me. And in his own dreams, he can have this chance to imagine what would it look like to give a different response, to see the people in a more positive frame. And I'm going to pull that up. But so it's a kind of a crazy idea, right? Which is essentially to say, Bilam didn't exist at all. Right? Balak was having trouble with Bnei Israel for sure. Maybe he tried to do something to sabotage them, but that this whole idea of this prophet for hire who comes to say curses but ends up saying brachot is actually just a figment of Moshe's imagination, which is like a super crazy thing to say. And I don't think that's really what Rashi meant when he gave his commentary. And I'm just looking for that spot. But I think that in some ways, it makes the whole story make a lot more sense. That's why it's like a little bit disjointed. That's why a non-Jewish prophet can speak to God. That's why, the donkey talks, because all of this is like almost like an aspirational dream, a good dream for Moshe, where he's saying like, what would it feel like to say this instead of that? And there, I think that like the message of Bilam is like, it's okay to try on other identities or personalities to figure out like what is the right thing. Yes, exactly. So similar idea. Thank you, Rebecca, for mentioning it. Right, is that the Gemara also thinks that Moshe imagined the book of Job, of Eov, because Moshe's side authorship is pretty dark. Well, so I think that, right, if you think of like Moshe's side authorship, right, of writing Eov, which is a book about someone being cursed by God, sort of confusingly, or you think about Moshe as writing this whole Bilam narrative in his head, that to me, it feels like almost like a therapeutic experience for Moshe. Where he's like writing out his anger or his frustration with God or the people or whatever it is, in a way that could help him be a better leader, right? Like sometimes when you're angry at someone, if you like go into your office and shut the door and just like text your friend about how much you hate your coworker, then you can like come back out and say like, okay, let's try this again, right? But if you allow those things to bubble up inside of you with no outlet, and like maybe Moshe needed a therapist, but he didn't have one, so he wrote the book of Eov instead. But right, like what would it look like to be able to imagine those things, and to use that as a way to clear your head, to try on another perspective, to to exercise those things from yourself. Was someone saying that?
I just want to say that idea really resonates with me quite a lot, because it bothers me when I hear people say, well, we just have to do the right thing. And then I always go, well, who decides what's the right thing? Because the older you get, the more you understand that these kind of things are pretty ambiguous. So then I go to thinking, well, we have this whole Torah and all these commandments, the sum total of which, it helps guide us. But Moshe didn't have that stuff yet,
Yeah.
And right. So your idea resonates with me quite a lot about his dialogue with himself, maybe, or his dream.
Yeah, I like that, Kathy. Like Moshe didn't have it, and he didn't have the partner with whom to do it, I think was a big part of his problem.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I just, again, I just like that idea, right? I think it gives like a different color to the story. I think it makes more sense on some level as a dream than a reality, and that it helps Moshe, role play maybe out his problem on some level. I'm not sure what he's role playing in Eov and like how that works out for him, but I think here it's a little bit more clear, right? He's like trying on the role of positive prophet as opposed to negative prophet, right? Or like not frustrated prophet. And I think that the best lesson, and maybe like this third idea, is about how Bilam might have, like assuming whether Bilam is a dream or a real person, how he found this better perspective. And I think that the answer lies in hiking, in climbing up the mountain. Bilam spends a lot of time in this week's Parsha climbing, going up higher and higher mountains, trying to find some perspective. So let's see. Let's start with, I think it's chapter 23:13, right? That, hold on, I'm gonna pull it up if I can, but basically like Bilam starts in one place and then he says like, oh, I can't really see everybody. Let's go up a little higher, right? And then it was, no, sorry, 22:14, right? He says, let's go up where we can see a portion of the people. So they go up there. And then he says, no, but I don't want to see a portion of them. I want to see all of them. And then before he gives his Ma tovu ohalecha Yaakov, it says that he saw all of Israel camped by their tribes. And so he got this broader perspective. So before I went to Maharat, I got a different degree. I love advanced degrees and the ivory tower of learning. And I got a master's where I learned a lot from leadership experts, Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky. I think they're fantastic. I recommend all of their books. And they talk about this idea of the dance floor and the balcony. I don't know if anyone's familiar with this analogy, but what they say is that when you're on the dance floor, it's like really loud. People elbow you. It's hot and sweaty. It's hard to get perspective and it's hard to see like the big picture. And so that what they advise is that you need the perspective that a balcony can give you. If you climb up onto the balcony above the dance floor, you get this perspective in this place that might be relatively quiet, where you can see everything, right? And you need to be to be an effective leader, or perhaps in the case of Moshe slash Bilam, like prophets at large, you need to be able to be comfortable in both spaces, right? Like one of the things that Ron Heifetz says is that like only being a balcony leader makes you sort of removed and not relatable to your people, and only being a dance floor leader makes you unable to like take the people on a bigger vision. And I think that Moshe is a leader who is stuck on the dance floor, right? He is stuck in all of the like little nitty gritty complaints of the midbar. He is stuck in all of the frustrations of Bnei Israel, and he can't like find the time to go onto the balcony. And so maybe in his dream, like he knows that, right? He knows he needs to get up on the balcony. And so that's part of why Bilam has to climb higher and higher. He has to see all of Bnei Israel. And so we have to spend some time, you know, climbing onto the balcony of our, again, of our lives, of our communities, of our families, whatever it is, to be able to find the space to then like jump back down onto the dance floor in a way that feels healthy and happy and all of those things. So I think this question of like Bilam as visionary or heretic is a super interesting one. And that at the end of the day, I think he is more visionary than heretic, because even though it's not clear what his morals or values do to guide him and what he really hears from God, we retain like the best that Bilam has to offer, right? If he's a real person. And we sing Matovu in all of our liturgy, and that, you know, some of the time leaders are misguided, and some of the time we're living out our more holy divine callings. And it's our job as people, as communities, to sort of figure out which is which and to help steer people back on the right side of the path, right? To say, actually, like this path is not really the one you desire, right? Don't allow yourself to give into that piece of it. And then to also think about like, if you're feeling frustrated, are you in the wrong space in the party? And is it better to take some time away from the dance floor, or maybe you feel lonely and you'd rather take some time on the dance floor? So, you know, I think that that's a like another aspect of the puzzle, is that it's wonderful to think about being able to change perspective and to be able to have the like imagination to try on new ideas. So I think what I take from Bilam and from this story sort of in general, whether it's like a Moshe dream or a real life story, is that like as a community, when we're on the dance floor, it's great to dance to the same beat and to like enjoy the loudness and vibrancy of community. And that we also can find time to walk up onto the balcony and to see how that plays out in like a larger vision for our lives or our community's lives. Because I think that, you know, as units, whether it's family units or individual units, community units, like we are leaders and collaborators, we're dreamers, we're a place where our tents are open, right? Matovu ohalacha, and they are good. As long as we can find those balances between divine calling and personal motives, and balances between the dance floor and the balcony. And that when we see someone who strays too far to one side, we end up being suspicious, but it's like maybe not justified, right? In exactly the way that the rabbis took it. So I see Bilam as a really inspiring figure. I hope maybe this helps you guys think of him that way too. And if it is a dream, it's like an interesting breaking point in our story, because we'll pick back up next week with like even more disturbing tales. So that, you know, I open the floor. And Uriel, I'm not sure. I think that is probably right. I know that, right, certainly we know that we said that the snake used to speak. And I feel like I just read something, last week's parsha about when the snakes bite the people to create the plague, and then Moshe makes a snake. I think I read in just like the little English commentary, so I'd have to go back and fact check at the bottom of the Chumash that was like a fitting punishment because the people had spoken badly, just like the snake had spoken badly in Gan Eden and enticed them. So I do think that there is that there is something about that. And I will admit that I sat Yevamot out of Daf Yomi, although I'm into Kiddushin with fervor. But I could look back and see if I could find that. That's a great question. I'm going to make a note. Any other thoughts, ideas? Great. Well, I hope everyone has a lovely day. If I'm still here next Wednesday, I'm not going to be happy. But, but I will say it's a great topic, and Pinchas is also a super interesting guy. And I think that he is worthy of examination. So we'll see what we can do. But I wish everyone a happy and healthy week, and I hope to see you all on Shabbat in some way or another.
Thank you.
Thank you.